The ring was still warm when he found it, sitting inside a glass of water on the kitchen island. Her wedding ring, just sitting there at 6:44 in the morning while he stood in his bathrobe trying to understand what he was looking at. He called his head of security. The phone rang 4 times. It never rang 4 times. "Boss, something you need to know. Where is she?" A pause long enough to swallow a man whole. "We cannot find her." Park Joong-hyun, the most feared name in Seoul's underground, a man who controlled border crossings and judges and entire districts of this city, stood in his kitchen holding a phone and could not speak. Because the security footage from 3:17 that morning showed his wife, Patricia, walking out of their building with 1 suitcase, 1 coat, and 0 tears. No argument, no final words, no last look back at the life she had shared with him. She had simply finished with it, and she was gone before he even woke up. He had been cheating on her for 2 years. She had known about every single one of them. She had said nothing. She had smiled at his dinners and cooked his food and managed his household and watched him make every wrong choice a man can make. And then one morning before the city woke up, she had taken 1 suitcase and walked out and left behind a man who ran Seoul's most feared organization and had absolutely no idea where his wife was. Besties, welcome back. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because this story is going to live in your head for days. Drop where you are watching from in the comments. Before we go into today's story, if you love powerful mafia boss romances filled with passion, secrets, shocking twists, and unforgettable happy endings, you'll love the ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. It includes 15 complete stories, 20 audiobooks, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. You can grab your copy through the link in the description. Now, let's begin. Park Joong-hyun did not believe in accidents. He had built his entire philosophy around that conviction. Every meeting happened for a reason. Every introduction was either an opportunity or a threat. There was no category in his mind for coincidence. So when he first saw Patricia Okonkwo at a business reception in Itaewon on a Thursday night in October, standing near the window with a glass of water she was not drinking, looking out at the lights of Seoul with an expression so completely unreadable that he found himself looking at her for longer than he had looked at anything in years, he filed it under opportunity and walked toward her. She did not react the way women usually reacted to his approach. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people in rooms like that one registered him before he reached them. They shifted their weight, or smoothed their clothing, or did that thing where they tried to look more relaxed, precisely because they were becoming less relaxed. She did none of those things. She simply turned, looked at him with large dark eyes that gave away nothing, and said, in accented Korean that was better than most foreigners achieved in 5 years, "You are standing between me and the window." He stepped aside. She looked back at the city. He said, "You speak Korean." She said, "Apparently." He thought about that for a moment, and then he laughed. A real laugh, not the short performance he usually offered in social situations. She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in her expression that was curious and careful at the same time, like she was deciding whether he was interesting enough to continue a conversation with. He found that he wanted very badly to be interesting enough. Her name was Patricia Okonkwo. She was Nigerian, 31 years old, and she was in Seoul on a contract with an international trade firm that was doing infrastructure partnership negotiations with several Korean conglomerates. She had a degree in international finance from a university in London, and she had spent 4 years working in Abuja before the Seoul posting. She told him all of this over the next 40 minutes, in the calm, measured way of someone who was describing work history on a form, rather than introducing herself to a stranger. She gave him facts, not access. He found this absolutely maddening in the best possible way. He called her 3 days later. She answered, heard who it was, and said, "I assumed you would call sooner." He said, "I was giving you time to research me." She said, "I had already researched you before you walked over." He paused. And she said, "I am still here to take your call." That counts for something. He thought about that sentence for days afterward. "I am still here to take your call." She was not saying she was impressed. She was not saying she trusted him. She was simply saying that whatever she had found had not been enough to make her irrelevant, which meant she had looked at everything he was and decided to keep the door open by a fraction, and he would have to prove himself worthy of it being opened further. No woman had ever made Park Joong-hyun feel like he needed to prove himself worthy of anything. He was 35 years old. He had built an organization that reached into the arteries of Seoul's commercial underworld. He had properties in 3 countries and connections that made politicians answer his calls. He was not accustomed to proving himself. He found himself extremely motivated to try. They dated for 8 months. It was a strange and careful 8 months. He showed her his public world, the restaurants and the penthouse views and the car that cost more than a house. She received all of it with a quiet appreciation that was genuine but never dazzled. She was never dazzled, and he kept trying to dazzle her and failing, which meant he kept trying, which meant she was always on his mind. She was intelligent in ways that caught him off guard. At a dinner with 3 of his business associates, she made a passing comment about the inefficiency of a particular trade route that caused one of the men to set down his chopsticks and look at her, and then look at Joong-hyun and say, "Where did you find her?" Joong-hyun just smiled because he had been asking himself that question since October. She was funny, too, in a dry, understated way that he kept almost missing because she delivered her sharpest observations in the same calm tone she used for everything else. One evening, when he had been describing the loyalty structures within his organization with considerable pride, she had said, "It sounds like a very expensive way to have friends." He had been silent for 3 full seconds before he burst out laughing, and she looked at him with those unreadable eyes and did not even smile because she had not been making a joke. She had just been being precise. He proposed 8 months after they met. He did it with a ring that was not subtle and an evening that was extremely well planned, and she looked at the ring and then looked at him and said, "I need you to understand something first." He said, "Anything." She said, "I am not someone who will disappear into your world. If we do this, I remain myself inside it." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not sure you do, but I am willing to find out." They married in the spring. Small ceremony, 40 people, a venue in Yongsan that had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Han River. She wore ivory, and she looked like something from a different era, composed and precise, and completely at peace with herself, in a way that made every other person in the room seem like they were performing something. He kept looking at her throughout the ceremony with an expression that his head of security, Kwon Tae-soo, who was not a sentimental man, would later describe as a man who knew he had won something he did not fully understand yet. The first year of their marriage was, by every visible measure, extraordinary. She settled into his world with the calm efficiency she brought to everything. She learned the names of every member of his household staff and remembered details about their families. She navigated his social circle, which was a complex ecosystem of dangerous people maintaining polite performances, with a grace that impressed even the most guarded among them. She had a way of making people feel seen without making them feel exposed. which was a rare skill in any world, but particularly valuable in his. His mother, a small and exacting woman from Busan, who had greeted the idea of a Nigerian daughter-in-law with considerable skepticism, thawed within 3 months of knowing Patricia. Not because Patricia tried to win her over. She never tried. She simply was exactly who she was, consistently. And his mother eventually decided that consistency was the most trustworthy thing in a person. Joong-hyun watched all of this with a satisfaction that was new to him. He had spent his adult life building control, and he had always understood control as something you maintained through force or fear. What he did not understand, and what he would spend 3 years failing to understand, was that there was another kind of control entirely. The kind that came from someone who was so grounded in themselves that no external pressure could move them. He looked at Patricia and thought he saw serenity. He was looking at something else completely. He started cheating 14 months into the marriage. This is where the story requires honesty. So here it is. He did not start because he had stopped loving her, or because he had stopped finding her interesting, or because there was something wrong with their marriage that he could point to clearly. He started because he was Park Joong-hyun, and he had lived his entire adult life with no consequences, and the habit of no consequences is harder to break than any addiction. There was a woman named Choi Yerin who worked adjacent to one of his entertainment fronts. She was younger and louder, and she laughed at everything he said, and looked at him with the kind of open adoration that Patricia never offered, because Patricia had too much self-respect to offer it. Choi Yerin required nothing from him. She cost him nothing. And that, in the short-sighted economy of a man like Park Joong-hyun, felt very much like freedom. He was not careful about it. This is the part that requires the most honesty. He told himself he was careful. He told himself Patricia did not know, would not know, and even if she suspected something, she would not say anything, because she was not that kind of woman. He told himself all of this while Choi Yerin called his work phone with increasing frequency, and while the household staff began exchanging looks they thought he did not see, and while his wife, calm and observant, and always just slightly elsewhere in her attention, began to change in ways so subtle he could only recognize them in retrospect. The first time Patricia knew for certain was not from a phone she picked up or a message she accidentally saw. It was from a look. She had been in the kitchen one evening preparing food, which she did sometimes late at night when she could not sleep, moving through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who cooked as a form of thinking rather than as a task. He had come home late and walked through, and she had looked at him, not at his face, but at the total composition of him, and something in her expression had shifted so slightly that he had not noticed it, but she had. She had looked at him and in the space of 2 seconds had catalogued 12 things he did not know she was capable of cataloging, and had arrived at a conclusion she would not speak aloud for many months. She said nothing that night. She finished cooking, set a plate on the counter for him, and went to bed. He thought she had not noticed. She had noticed everything. And that was the moment, though neither of them understood it yet, when the real story of their marriage began. Not the wedding, not the first year, not the love, or the luxury, or the carefully maintained performance of power. The real story began in a kitchen in Gangnam, on a Tuesday night, when a woman looked at her husband and understood what she was dealing with, and instead of reacting, she began to think. Now you might be wondering at this point, why did she not leave immediately? And this is where Patricia is so different from the characters that get written for stories like this one. Because the answer is not that she could not leave. The answer is not that she was afraid. The answer is that she was strategic in a way that most people never have to be. because she had grown up in a world that taught her early that reacting from emotion cost you more than it ever cost the person you were reacting at. Her grandmother had told her once that the most powerful move a woman could make was to become so quiet and so clear that the people around her mistook her stillness for surrender. "Let them think you are surrendering," the old woman had said, "while you are becoming impossible to defeat." Patricia had never forgotten that, so she began to learn things. She began asking questions about the businesses, not accusatory questions, not suspicious questions, just the quiet, interested questions of a wife who was paying more attention to her husband's work. He answered readily, even with some pride, because it felt like she was becoming more engaged. In reality, she was building a map. She asked about properties. He told her. She asked about legal structures. He explained. She asked about who held what and in whose name and why certain arrangements were made the way they were. And he told her all of it, because she asked in the voice of someone who was simply curious, rather than in the voice of someone who was collecting evidence, which is the most important distinction in the world, and also the most difficult to fake. Patricia did not have to fake it. She genuinely was curious. She just did not tell him what the curiosity was for. Outside those conversations, she was building something else. She had maintained, throughout their marriage, a small independent consulting relationship with a trade firm she had worked with before she met Joong-hyun. He knew about it in a general way. He had never paid it close attention because it was small and professional, and seemed to him like the kind of thing an intelligent woman kept going to feel useful, which told you exactly how much he understood about what intelligence actually looked like in practice. What that consulting relationship actually was a financial identity that existed completely outside his reach. She had an account he did not know about. She had a legal advisor she had been meeting with for coffee every few weeks, a woman named Baek Ji-young, who had the kind of calm, architectural mind that understood exactly how assets could be structured to protect individuals inside complex marital situations. They had been having these meetings since the 8th month of the marriage, not because Patricia had known then what she knew now, but because she was the kind of woman who read the weather before the storm arrived. Joong-hyun, meanwhile, was becoming bolder. Choi Yerin was replaced, about 6 months in, by a woman named Han Soo-min, who was replaced 4 months after that by 2 different women who overlapped in ways that required a particular kind of organizational commitment. He had always been a man of considerable energy. He applied it to everything. He was not a man who did anything halfway, including things he should not have been doing at all. The household staff knew. The staff always knows. His driver knew. His personal assistant, a nervous young man named Do Kyung-sik, who had the unfortunate career of being between Joong-hyun and his bad decisions, knew and kept quiet, because keeping quiet was what Do Kyung-sik had decided was the safest policy in every situation. His head of security, Kwon Tae-soo, knew and said nothing, because Kwon Tae-soo operated on the principle that his job was to protect the boss from external threats, and whatever was happening inside the marriage was definitionally not an external threat. No one told Patricia, but no one needed to. She moved through the information the way she moved through everything, quietly, precisely, building a picture piece by piece, the way you assemble something complex from its smallest components. And by the end of the 2nd year of their marriage, she had a complete picture that was far more detailed than anything she could have obtained from confrontation. She knew the names. She knew the patterns. She knew which part of his schedule was real and which part was theater. She knew which business trips were business and which were not. She knew, in a way that was extraordinary in its detail, exactly who her husband was and exactly what he had been doing. And she said nothing, which drove him, on the one occasion when his perception actually caught up to something real, briefly and uncomfortably insane. It was late one evening, and they had been at dinner with two couples from his social world, and everyone had been performing pleasantness over extremely expensive food, and on the way home, she had been quiet in a way that was slightly different from her usual quietness. He had said, "You seem somewhere else tonight." She had said, "I am exactly here." He had looked at her, and for one brief uncomfortable moment he had felt the specific sensation of not knowing what was behind a face he looked at every day. The specific sensation of realizing that the person sitting next to him was not the simple thing he had assumed her to be. Then they arrived home, and the moment passed, and he went back to his phone, and forgot the discomfort, the way you forget the feeling of a door you passed, but did not open. He would remember it later, in full, devastating detail. He would remember it, and understand that that was the moment he had been given a chance to look at what was actually happening in his marriage, and had chosen not to, because looking was harder than not looking, and he was a man who had spent his entire life choosing what was easier for him. But that came later. For now, they were still inside the performance of a marriage that one of them was quietly dismantling from the inside, and the city of Seoul was going on around them the way Seoul always goes on, relentless and brilliant, and completely indifferent to the particular collapses happening in its most expensive buildings. Do you see what is happening here? Drop the word "watching" in the comments if you are seeing every move she is making. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it right now, because this story is about to hit a point you will not want to miss. The beginning of the third year brought with it a change in Joong-hyun that would have been visible to anyone who had been paying attention, and Patricia had been paying attention to nothing else for 18 months. He got comfortable. This is the particular corruption that comes from no consequences over a long enough period of time. A man who cheats and is never confronted does not become more cautious. He becomes more careless. He begins to believe, in the soft, unexamined part of himself where most men keep their worst assumptions about the people who love them, that the absence of confrontation is the same as the absence of knowledge. He mistakes silence for blindness. He mistakes stillness for ignorance. And once he makes that mistake, he stops being careful at all. The women became more present. Phone calls that would once have been taken in another room now happened in the study, with the door only halfway closed. A name she recognized would appear on his phone screen while he was in the kitchen, and he would look at it and put the phone face down and look at her, and she would be doing something else entirely, cutting fruit or reviewing a document, and he would wait for the reaction that never came, and then convince himself again that she did not know, could not know, and this was fine. It was not fine. She knew everything. She was simply choosing when to deploy what she knew, which is a completely different thing from not knowing at all, and a much more powerful position than he could imagine. The incident with Joong-hyun was when everything changed in a way that even Joong-hyun could not rationalize. Joong-hyun was 24 years old, and she worked at one of his entertainment venues, and she had the specific quality of someone who had been told her entire life that she was special, in ways that required everyone around her to confirm constantly. She was beautiful in a loud, obvious way that Joong-hyun, in his current state of comfortable carelessness, found very easy to be around. She required no depth. She required no interesting conversation. She required only to be looked at and told she was wonderful, and he was very willing to provide this, because providing this cost him nothing and gave him the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of someone's complete and easy admiration. Joong-hyun also had the particular quality of someone who, upon learning she was involved with a married man, decided that the correct response was not to exit the situation, but to escalate it until the wife became aware that she existed. This is a specific type of thinking that operates on the logic that visibility equals power, and it is the logic of someone who has never actually come face to face with the particular quality of power that comes from someone like Patricia. She called the penthouse landline. This was not an accident. The penthouse did not appear in any public directory. Someone had given her the number. Later, after everything, Joong-hyun would spend considerable effort establishing who that someone was. But that was later. For now, there was a Tuesday afternoon and a phone ringing and the housekeeper answering, and then the housekeeper's face doing something complicated, and then the housekeeper bringing the phone to Patricia with an expression that was the closest a professional could come to. "I am so sorry about what is happening right now." Patricia took the phone. She said hello. The voice on the other end was young and bright and had the quality of someone who had rehearsed this. She said, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Don't you?" Patricia was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "I am not sure what conversation you are referring to, but I appreciate the honesty. Is there something specific you wanted me to know?" There was a pause on the other end. This was not the response that had been expected. The expected response was tears, or anger, or begging. The expected response was some form of collapse. What Joong-hyun got instead was a woman who sounded the way a particularly composed doctor sounds when delivering test results. Clinical, complete, unbroken. Joong-hyun said, "Your husband and I have been seeing each other for 3 months. Patricia said, "Thank you for telling me. Is there anything else?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I thought you should know." "Yes," Patricia said. "You mentioned. Thank you." She ended the call, set the phone on the side table with exactly the same care she set every object down, and went back to the work she had been doing before the phone rang. The housekeeper, Mrs. Im, who had been standing in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had witnessed something she could not categorize, would later tell the only person she trusted in the household, the head cook, that in 30 years of working in other people's homes, she had never seen anything like that. Not the call. The call was unpleasant, but not surprising. What was extraordinary was the response. It was like watching someone get told the weather was going to change, and respond by finishing their tea. What Mrs. Im did not know, what no one in the household knew, was what Patricia did for the next 3 hours after that call. She closed her office door, which she rarely did, and she sat at her desk with a notepad, and she made a list. Not of grievances, not of the things she felt. She made a list of every asset she had confirmed knowledge of, every account she had access to, or had documented, every legal arrangement she had spent 18 months quietly understanding. She made the list in the careful handwriting of someone who had been trained to be precise, and when she was done, she sat with it and read it twice, and then she put it away in the locked drawer of her desk that had always been hers, that he had never had a key to, and she opened her door and went to the kitchen and made dinner. She did not tell him about the call. He found out 6 days later when Joong-hyun, receiving no satisfying reaction from the wife, went to him directly and told him what she had done. His face, by his driver's later account, did something genuinely unprecedented. Park Joong-hyun, a man who had sat across from prosecutors and rival bosses, and a man who had once been threatened with a weapon and had held the threatening man's gaze without blinking, showed fear. Not dramatic fear, a small, quiet fear, the kind that arrives when you suddenly understand that the ground beneath you is not as solid as you assumed. He came home that evening earlier than usual. Patricia was in the living room reading. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she looked up at him, and he looked at her, and there was a long pause where he was clearly deciding how to approach what he needed to approach. She said, "You look tired." He said, "Why did you not tell me?" she called. Patricia looked at him with the same expression she might use when someone asked why she had not mentioned the weather. "I assumed you knew she was the type to do that." She went back to her book. He came and sat across from her. He said, "I know this has been going on too long. I know this is not how things should be." She turned a page. He said, "I want to fix this." She looked up. He was genuinely trying to read her, and finding, as he always found, that there was nothing available for him to read. She was not cold. She was not warm. She was simply present, and complete, and entirely her own. She said, "What would fixing it look like to you?" He said, "I would stop. Whatever this has become, I would end it. I would focus on what we have." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Joong-hyun, let me ask you something. Do you remember what I said to you when you proposed?" He thought. He said, "You said you were not someone who would disappear into my world." She nodded. "And did I?" He said, "No." And even as he said it, something moved in his chest that he did not have a name for yet, something that was the beginning of comprehension. She said, "I told you I would remain myself inside your world. I told you that from the beginning." She closed her book. She was not angry. She was not hurt, or if she was, she had the hurt somewhere. He could not see it. What she looked like was someone who had completed a calculation and was waiting, patiently, for the numbers to reveal themselves to the other person in the room. "I think you should get some sleep," she said. "You do look tired." He went to bed. He did not sleep. She sat in the living room for another hour, with her book closed on her lap, and she thought about what came next. And her expression, had anyone been there to see it, was not sad, and not triumphant, and not afraid. It was the expression of someone who has decided something, fully and finally and without any remaining uncertainty. The expression of a woman who has just realized she is no longer waiting for anything. The change in her behavior over the following weeks was subtle enough that he almost missed it again. Almost. She became more organized. She began sorting through things that had accumulated over 3 years of shared living. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone who was preparing to leave, but in the quiet way of someone who was simply becoming cleaner in their habits. She donated things she no longer used. She updated her personal documents, something she mentioned to him casually over dinner, as if this was simply a routine administrative thing a person did. She increased the hours she spent on her consulting work, again casually, again in the way of someone who was simply engaging more with a professional interest. He watched all of this and told himself it was good. She was more engaged. She was more organized. She was perhaps responding to his attempt at honesty by becoming more present in her own life. He told himself a comforting story about what he was seeing and went on with his life. 3 things happened in the 5th week after the phone call that mattered enormously, though he would only understand their significance much later. The first was that Patricia had a long lunch with Baek Ji-young, the legal advisor she had been seeing for coffee for almost 2 years. This lunch was different from the coffees. The lunch lasted 2.5 hours and involved documents, which Baek Ji-young carried in a structured case, and at the end of it, Patricia signed 3 things and walked out with copies in her bag and an expression that was even more settled than usual, if such a thing was possible. The second was that she transferred a sum of money that she was entirely entitled to transfer from an account that had always been hers into a new account in a bank he had no relationship with, in a denomination that was notable but not dramatic. The third was that she booked 2 flights. One was a return flight, one was not. He did not know about any of this. His financial people monitored accounts that were connected to his organization. Her personal accounts had always been separate, and he had never thought to ask about them in any detail, because he had always assumed, in the casual way of a man who could not imagine being outmaneuvered by someone standing quietly at his elbow, that her finances were a smaller and simpler version of his own. They were not. They were completely separate, and they were extraordinarily well managed, and they had been building quietly since before she had ever walked through his door. One of the things that would strike him later, when he was sitting in the ruins of the understanding he had had of his marriage, was that she had never lied to him about money. She had never claimed to need him financially. In the early days of the relationship, he had offered to consolidate their finances, and she had said, "I think we should keep them separate," and he had agreed, because it seemed reasonable, and because he was not thinking about what that structure might mean 3 years down the line. He was thinking about dinner. He was always thinking about dinner or the immediate next meeting or the problem directly in front of his face, and she was always thinking about structures. This, in the end, was the fundamental difference between them. He was tactical. She was architectural. He solved the problem in front of him. She built systems that meant the problems in front of her would be different ones entirely. In the 6th week after the phone call, Joong-hyun made her second mistake. The first had been the phone call. The second was showing up. She arrived at a function that Joong-hyun was attending, a dinner for a business associate's birthday, the kind of occasion where the guest list was controlled enough that her presence was not an accident. Someone had put her on it. Joong-hyun's expression when he saw her across the room was the expression of a man watching a controlled situation become uncontrolled, which was the expression he found most intolerable of all. Patricia was beside him. She saw Joong-hyun at the same moment he did. She watched his face. She watched his body language change. She watched the micro-adjustments of a man deciding how to manage a problem that had just walked into a room wearing a red dress and looking directly at him. Then she watched something else. She watched Joong-hyun look at her and smile. The smile of someone who had decided to win something and believed she was winning it. Patricia looked at her and nodded. The way you nod at an acquaintance at a distance. Pleasant, minimal, entirely neutral. Joong-hyun's smile flickered. Joong-hyun, who had been watching both of them and holding his breath, saw the flicker and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Respect, not for Joong-hyun, for his wife. He leaned toward Patricia and said, very quietly, "I am going to take care of this," she said, already taking care of themselves. He looked at her. She was watching the room, not Joong-hyun specifically, just the room, with the casual, comprehensive attention she always had in social situations. She looked, he thought with a clarity that arrived too late, like she always looked, like someone who was exactly where she had decided to be, and completely unimpressed by the alternatives. The evening continued. Joong-hyun, receiving neither the desired reaction nor the desired attention, eventually maneuvered herself into a conversation near the bar and stayed there for the rest of the night, being loudly charming at people who had no idea who she was. Patricia had 2 glasses of water and talked with the host's wife about an art exhibit, and smiled when it was appropriate to smile. In the car going home, she said nothing about any of it. He said, "I know that was uncomfortable." She said, "Was it? I had a very pleasant conversation about ceramics." He looked at her sideways for a long moment. She looked out the window, and that night, alone, in the separate quiet of her bathroom that had always been only hers, Patricia stood in front of the mirror for a moment. and allowed herself to feel everything that she kept out of her expression in public. Not anger, though the anger was there. Not hurt, though that was there too. What she allowed herself to feel, very briefly, was a profound tiredness. The tiredness that comes from carrying a performance for a long time. Not the performance of happiness. She was not performing happiness, but the performance of patience, of strategic delay, of remaining exactly steady on the outside while the inside was doing the complex, exhausting work of building a future. She was almost done building it. She looked at herself in the mirror and she said, out loud, to no one, almost. And then she washed her face and went to bed. The next 2 weeks moved quickly in ways that no one watching from outside would have characterized as quick. Joong-hyun ended things with Joong-hyun, formally, in the sense that he told her it was over, and stopped responding to her messages. Whether this was because of genuine remorse, or because Joong-hyun had introduced chaos into controlled situations twice, and he considered this professionally unacceptable, was a question he did not examine too closely. He told himself it was remorse. He told himself he was choosing his marriage. He did not begin to examine the third and fourth women in the way that this kind of honest accounting would have required, because honest accounting was not something he had ever developed a habit of. He was, in his mind, improving, becoming better, choosing correctly. Patricia, who knew about the others he was not thinking about, watched him choose and said nothing, and made the last of her arrangements. She moved her remaining personal items, a category of things that looked like ordinary life in their apartment, but were in fact her entire independent existence in physical form, in the casual, scattered way of someone who was reorganizing a closet rather than consolidating a life. A few things to her office, a few things she mentioned casually giving to a colleague who was moving, a book she said she was lending, a piece of jewelry she said she was having cleaned. He noticed none of it. He was not looking for anything to notice. The last significant evening of their marriage, though neither of them framed it that way at the time, was a Thursday. They had dinner together, the two of them, in the kitchen rather than the dining room, because she had said she felt like something simple, and she had made jollof rice with the same focused attention she brought to everything she cooked. It was, by any objective measure, extraordinary food. He had always loved her cooking. There was a way she had with flavors that he had never been able to fully describe, a precision that was somehow also warmth, the same paradox that described everything about her. They ate together and talked about small things. Something he had read that morning. A film she had seen with a colleague. A problem with a pipe in the east hallway that had been reported by the housekeeper and was going to need attention. It was the kind of conversation that marriages have when they are either deeply comfortable or very close to ending. And from the outside, it would have been impossible to tell which kind this was. At the end of dinner, she said, "I am going to read for a while before bed." He said, "I have some calls to make." She said, "Okay." And she looked at him for a moment. Not in the way she usually looked at him, which was with the careful, neutral attention she had always maintained, but in a way that was slightly different, slightly more complete, like she was seeing something she wanted to remember. He did not notice the difference. He went to his study. She went to the living room with her book. At 2 in the morning his calls were finished, and the penthouse was quiet, and he assumed she had gone to bed, and he went to the kitchen for water, and noticed that the living room light was off, and thought nothing of it, and went to bed himself. At 3:17 in the morning, Patricia Okonkwo walked out of her husband's building with one suitcase and got into a car that was not one of his, driven by someone she had arranged herself, and disappeared into Seoul and then out of it. She left her wedding ring in a glass of water on the kitchen island. Not as a theatrical gesture, though it read as one. She left it there because the glass was there, and the ring was on her hand, and she took it off and placed it somewhere stable so it would not roll off a counter or be lost. Because she was Patricia, and even in her most significant moments, she was precise about practical things. She also left an envelope on the kitchen counter beside the glass. It was sealed. On the front, in her careful handwriting, was one word: his name. Inside the envelope was a legal document, 4 pages, in language he would need his own lawyers to fully interpret, but which summarized, in terms that would become devastatingly clear over the following weeks, exactly what their 3 years of marriage had meant in structural and legal terms, and exactly what his wife had understood about their arrangement that he had never understood at all. He found the ring at 6:44. He found the envelope at 6:47. He read the first page 3 times before calling his lawyers. His lawyers called him back at 8:15 in the morning, with voices that had the particular quality of professionals, delivering information that exceeds the category of bad news and enters the category of reorientation. He sat at the kitchen counter listening to them and looking at the glass with the ring in it. And outside the windows of his penthouse, Seoul was beginning its morning. Millions of people going about their lives completely unaware that Park Joong-hyun, the man who controlled entire districts of the city's underworld, was sitting in his kitchen, discovering that the most dangerous thing he had ever failed to pay attention to was the woman he came home to every night. Before we continue, a quick note for everyone who loves these Mafia Boss romance stories. I've bundled 20 of our most loved Afro-Korean romance stories into the ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. You'll get all 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, plus 5 exclusive bonus stories you won't find on YouTube. If you'd love to enjoy these stories anytime, without ads or interruptions, you'll find the link in the description below. The lawyers came to the penthouse at 10 that morning. 3 of them, which was already a signal. Joong-hyun had worked with lawyers his entire professional life, and he knew that when they sent 3, the information required more than one person to deliver without the whole thing collapsing into chaos. The lead lawyer was a man named Oh Sung-jae, who had been handling the legal structure of Joong-hyun's holdings for 6 years, and who spoke with the carefully weighted tone of a professional who had understood for some time that this moment was coming, and had spent that time preparing how to explain it without being held personally responsible for what it contained. He sat across from Joong-hyun at the kitchen table, which still had the glass on it, the ring visible inside, because no one had moved it. The other 2 lawyers arranged themselves slightly behind their lead, like backup singers who hoped very much not to be called upon. Oh Sung-jae said, "I am going to explain the document your wife left. Some of what I tell you will be difficult to hear." Joong-hyun said, "Start." The first thing Oh Sung-jae explained was the prenuptial framework. They had signed a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. Joong-hyun remembered this. It had been a standard protection, his lawyers at the time had told him, ensuring that his assets remained separate from the marital estate in the event of dissolution. He had been satisfied with this. He had assumed it protected him. What he had not read, because he had trusted his lawyers at the time to summarize accurately and had never found it necessary to read 40 pages of legal language himself, was a specific clause in the 6th section that addressed custodial rights over certain business documents. Specifically, in the event of marital misconduct defined by a list of behaviors she and her lawyer had included that his lawyers at the time had assured him were standard and uncontroversial, she was entitled to receive copies of documentation relating to certain business operations she had been directly involved in supporting. She had been directly involved in supporting several operations. Not because he had asked her to be, because she had inserted herself quietly, over the course of their marriage, into exactly the right administrative positions to be considered a supporting party in legal terms. She had never touched anything that was clearly criminal. She had stayed in the ambient zone of the legitimate business structures that wrapped around the illegal ones, helping with things that looked ordinary, that were ordinary on paper, while understanding exactly what they were adjacent to. She had been building a map. The map was legal documentation. Oh, Sung-jae paused at this point in the explanation to give Joong-hyun a moment. Joong-hyun did not use the moment for what it was offered for. He used it to sit very still and breathe. Oh, Sung-jae continued. There was a second element. Several of the properties in Joong-hyun's portfolio had been partially structured, at various points over the past 2 years, using a holding company that had been established in both their names. This had happened through a series of amendments and transfers that had been processed, correctly and legally, through an administrative layer of the organization that Joong-hyun oversaw in a general sense, but did not review personally. Someone in that administrative layer had been quietly helping the process along. Joong-hyun asked who. Oh Sung-jae looked at the table briefly before answering. Do Kyung-sik, his personal assistant, the nervous young man who had always kept quiet, who had been present in the margins of every significant meeting, who had access to every administrative system in the organization. The nervous young man who had, apparently, been quietly terrified, not of Park Joong-hyun, but of what happened to people who did not prepare adequately for their futures, and who had at some point in the past 2 years decided that preparing adequately for his future meant not being on the wrong side of a woman like Patricia Okonkwo. Joong-hyun made a sound that Oh Sung-jae would later describe to his associate as the specific sound of a man realizing he has been completely outmaneuvered by people he had not been watching. The third element was the most straightforward and also, in some ways, the most devastating. Over the course of their marriage, several of the legitimate business agreements that fronted the more complex operations had been structured to require countersignature from the supporting partner of the holding company, which was Patricia, in her administrative capacity. Because these signatures had been embedded in routine documents, they had been obtained without anyone flagging them as significant. They were not significant individually. Together, they constituted a level of procedural involvement that gave her standing in several ongoing agreements. She had not taken anything that was not hers. This was the most important part of Oh Sung-jae's explanation, and he delivered it with considerable emphasis. She had not stolen. She had not defrauded. She had simply, over the course of 3 years, structured herself into a position of quiet procedural relevance in exactly the portions of his business architecture that he would most prefer to keep private. And in leaving, she carried that relevance with her. Not as a weapon, Oh Sung-jae was at pains to explain. There was no indication she intended to use it against him. The document she had left was not a threat. It was a summary. Here is what existed. Here is what I know. Here is what I have copies of. She was not promising to destroy him. She was simply informing him that the power to do so existed, if she chose to use it. She had not chosen to use it. She had simply chosen to leave. Joong-hyun sat with this for a very long time. The lawyers sat with him in the way that lawyers sit when they have delivered the worst of what they have to deliver and are now waiting to see whether they need to begin the next phase of damage control or whether the client requires a moment. He required a moment. He thought about the woman he had married and the woman he had been living with and whether they were the same woman or whether they were. Yes, they were. He understood suddenly, with the particular clarity that arrives when the obvious reveals itself through 3 years of accumulated evidence, that they had always been the same woman. She had been exactly who she had told him she was, from the very first conversation at that window in Itaewon. She had told him she was not someone who would disappear into his world. She had meant that in every possible interpretation of the sentence. She had remained herself inside his world, which meant that who she was had continued operating inside his world the entire time, quietly and completely. And what she was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary patience and extraordinary strategic clarity, who had understood from quite early in the marriage exactly what was happening and had responded to it not with emotion but with architecture. He had looked at her every day for 3 years and seen a wife. She had been building an exit strategy. No, that was not quite right either. He sat with it more carefully. She had not come into the marriage planning to leave. He did not believe that. What he believed, sitting at the kitchen table with the ring and the glass, and the lawyers arranged around him and the morning coming through the windows, was that she had come into the marriage willing to stay. She had genuinely wanted to stay. She had told him what she needed in order to stay, and he had not provided it. He had provided money and luxury and the social power of his name, and he had provided absolutely none of the things she had actually asked for, which were honesty and presence and the basic dignity of being someone's actual partner rather than their contained property. And at some point she had accepted that he was not going to provide those things, and she had begun to build accordingly. She had not left in anger, she had left in completion. She had simply finished what she had been building and walked out when it was ready, which meant the leaving was not a response to anything he had done most recently. The leaving had been coming for a very long time. He found himself thinking about every conversation he could remember, looking for the moment when she had moved from hoping to preparing. He could not find it precisely. He thought maybe it was the night she had looked at him in the kitchen and he had thought she had not noticed anything. He thought maybe it was before that. He thought maybe it had been in the car after the dinner, where Joong-hyun had appeared in the red dress, when Patricia had said she'd had a pleasant conversation about ceramics, and he had looked at her sideways and not known what was behind her face. He thought maybe it was even further back than that. Maybe it was very early. Maybe she had known from quite close to the beginning what kind of man she had married, and she had given the marriage time and honesty, the chance to prove her wrong, and they had not. Oh, Sung-jae said, gently, "What would you like us to do?" Joong-hyun said, "Find her." Oh, Sung-jae looked at the table again briefly. He said, "We have looked into that. With respect, her exit from the country was entirely legal. She is an adult, with her own passport and her own travel plans and her own financial resources. There is no legal mechanism to compel her return." Joong-hyun said, "I am not asking about legal mechanisms." Oh, Sung-jae said, "I know." He paused. "I would advise strongly against other mechanisms. In light of the documentation she holds and the structure of what she has left behind." Joong-hyun looked at him. Oh, Sung-jae said, very carefully, "She has not hurt you with what she knows. If you approach this situation through other means, that could change." He let that sit in the room for a moment. She has also not gone to the press, not gone to any regulatory body, and not alerted anyone in a position of official authority. She appears to have simply left, which means you are currently only dealing with the complications of her absence. Those complications are significant but manageable. The alternatives could be considerably worse. Joong-hyun sat with this. He had spent 20 years making people afraid of what happened when they crossed him. He was now receiving careful advice not to cross the person who had left him, because she had positioned herself in such a way that crossing her would hurt him more than he could hurt her. He almost laughed, not from amusement, from the specific sensation of recognizing something brilliant, even when you are the person it has been deployed against. He told the lawyers to go. They went, with considerable speed for professionals trying to appear unhurried. He sat alone in the kitchen with the ring in the glass. He called Kwon Tae-soo. Kwon Tae-soo came. He sat where the lawyers had sat. He looked at the ring in the glass and then at his boss and waited. Joong-hyun said, "She is gone." Kwon Tae-soo said, "I know." He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he had expected this. He said nothing that was not asked for. Joong-hyun said, "Did you know what she was doing?" Kwon Tae-soo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew she was making preparations. I did not know the full extent." "Why did you not tell me?" Another quiet moment. Then, "Because telling you would have required telling you what she was preparing against." He looked at his boss without looking away. "Which would have required telling you that what you were doing was enough to make a woman that intelligent decide to leave." Joong-hyun looked at him. Kwon Tae-soo held the look without flinching, in the way that only very long loyalty gives a person permission to do. Joong-hyun said, "Why did you not say anything about it earlier? Before this happened?" Kwon Tae-soo said, "I tried once. You told me the marriage was not my concern." He had said that, some 18 months ago, when Kwon Tae-soo had said, with the hesitation of a man choosing words with great care, that there were some things he thought might be worth Joong-hyun's attention at home. Joong-hyun had been in the middle of something else, and he had said, "The marriage is not your concern," and Kwon Tae-soo had not raised it again. He sat with this too. He had been told, by the person he trusted most, in the most limited and careful way possible, he had been told there was something worth his attention, and he had said it was not his concern. His own marriage. Not his concern. He asked Kwon Tae-soo to leave. Kwon Tae-soo left. The apartment was very quiet. It was always quiet. He had never noticed how quiet it was, because there had always been someone else in it. Someone whose quietness had paradoxically made the space feel inhabited. And now that she was gone, the apartment was the same exact decibels of silence it had always been, and it felt utterly empty. He tried to understand the difference and could not, which was perhaps the most honest reflection of what he had lost. He did not eat that day. He did not make the calls he had on his schedule. He sat in various parts of the apartment, at various points throughout the day, in the way of a man who cannot decide where he belongs in a space he has occupied for years, because the space has changed without anything in it having changed, because the change was not in the apartment, but in the understanding of what the apartment was, without her in it. In the evening, he found himself in the kitchen again. He looked at the glass with the ring. He looked at the counters where she had cooked. He looked at the shelf where she kept the spices organized in a system that was completely her own, and that he had never asked her to explain. He looked at these things and understood that for 3 years he had been living alongside the evidence of a person, a complete and extraordinary person, without looking at any of it. He had been in the same room with a rare and specific kind of intelligence and love, and had treated both as furniture. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried, which was its own kind of loss in a way he was not equipped to examine right now. What he did was sit on the kitchen floor, with his back against the cabinet, and look at the glass on the counter from below, and stay there for a long time in the silence of the emptiest place he had ever inhabited. In Lagos, in an apartment that was clean and modest and entirely her own, Patricia Okonkwo was drinking tea and reading a contract for a new consulting engagement she had confirmed 2 weeks before leaving Seoul. She had a flight in 3 days to London, where she had a meeting with a trade partner she had been cultivating for a year. Her life, which had been proceeding in parallel to her marriage this entire time, was moving forward with the same organized efficiency it had always had. She was fine, She was better than fine. She was tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. And the tiredness was dissolving with every hour that passed in the clean air of her own freedom. She thought about him sometimes, not with anger, not with the kind of bitterness that hardens into permanence. She thought about the dinner the night before she left, the jollof rice and the small conversation, and the way he had looked at her food like he loved it, which he did. He genuinely did love her food, and thought about how someone could love a thing without ever being curious about the hands that made it, and felt the particular sadness of that, which was not the sadness of grief, but the sadness of waste. She had genuinely loved him. This was true, and she held it carefully, because it was a true thing, and it deserved to be held rather than discarded. She had loved the man she saw briefly and intermittently through the armor of his particular way of being in the world, the man who had laughed at her honesty in that first conversation, the man who had been genuinely curious about her, the man who had, for a period of their early marriage, looked at her like she was something he had not expected to find and could not quite believe he had. That man was real. He had just been surrounded by so many other versions of himself that he had never developed the habit of choosing him. She did not wish him harm. She wished him the specific discomfort of clarity, which in her experience was the only thing that ever moved people who had lived too long without consequences. Whether he would use that clarity to change was not her responsibility to determine. Her responsibility was to herself, and she had been meeting it, carefully and completely, for 3 years, and she intended to keep doing so. She opened the contract and picked up her pen. Back in Seoul, Park Joong-hyun spent 3 days in various stages of the specific grief that comes not from loss alone, but from the recognition of what you caused. His business continued around him because it was built to continue without him in short stretches, which was its own comment on how much of his identity had been professional rather than personal. His associates noticed something was different. They did not ask. In his world, you did not ask. On the 4th day, he received a message through an intermediary that came originally from Baek Ji-young, Patricia's lawyer, and which said, in the measured language of legal communication, that his wife was not seeking any legal action or financial claims beyond what the prenuptial agreement already specified, that she wished the matter to be handled with minimal conflict, and that if he attempted to locate or contact her through any means other than formal legal channels, she would consider the documentation she held to be actively relevant to her security and would manage it accordingly. She was not threatening him. She was reminding him that she had the power to threaten him and was choosing not to use it, and that choice was conditional on his behavior. He read the message twice, and then he did something that surprised him, and possibly would have surprised anyone who knew him. He wrote back, through the same intermediary channel, 1 sentence. He wrote, "I understand." And then, after a moment, he added 1 more sentence. He wrote, "I am sorry." He did not know if she received it. He did not know if she believed it. He found that whether or not she believed it, it was the truest thing he had said in a very long time, which told him more about the state of his life than anything the lawyers had explained. His business, which Oh Sung-jae had called manageable, was managing. But the complications were real. 3 ongoing agreements had stalled because of the procedural complexities that emerged from the shared holding company structure. 2 business partners who had known Patricia peripherally and had respected her intelligence were asking questions he did not have clean answers to. Do Kyung-sik had disappeared the same night she did, which was a loss that was professionally significant in a way he had not anticipated, because it turned out Do Kyung-sik had been quietly holding together more administrative threads than anyone had noticed. Because Do Kyung-sik was efficient and invisible in the way of people who understand that being underestimated is a form of protection. He hired 3 people to replace Do Kyung-sik, and the work still moved slower. This was instructive. He did not drink more than usual. He did not become violent or chaotic in the way of some men in crisis. He went to work, and he sat with what he had done, and he did not look for someone to blame, because there was no one to blame, and he knew it. And he was, in the ash and silence of everything, honest enough to admit it. The man who had thought he could keep everything and lose nothing had discovered that the things he thought he had kept were considerably less than he had believed, and the thing he had lost was considerably more than he had known he had. The most powerful man in the room had spent 3 years failing to understand that the most powerful person in his life was the woman he came home to. And now he came home to a glass with a ring in it. And Seoul went on around him, indifferent and brilliant, doing what it always did. The world did not stop for Park Joong-hyun's marriage ending. This is one of the things he discovered in the weeks and months that followed. Not as a surprise exactly, more as a confirmation of something he had always known in theory, but had never had personal cause to experience. The city moved. His organization moved. His phone rang. Problems appeared and required solving, and he solved them with the same precision he had always brought to problems, because professional precision was something he had deeply, and the personal collapse did not reach all the way down into that particular competence. He was still good at what he did. He had just lost the context that had been making him feel like that was enough. 2 months after Patricia left, he received a photograph through an indirect channel. He did not know who sent it or why. The photograph showed Patricia at what appeared to be a professional event in London, standing with a group of people in front of a building with large glass windows, holding a coffee and saying something that had made the person next to her laugh. She was wearing a gray blazer, and she had the same expression she always had in public, composed and present, and entirely self-contained. She looked well. She looked like someone who had slept properly for the first time in a while, and was carrying her own weight easily. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he put his phone down and did not look at it again. He thought about her differently now than he had during the marriage. During the marriage, he had thought about her in the terms that a man thinks about the woman he lives with, which is to say, he had thought about her mostly in relation to himself. Whether she was happy because of something he had done or not done, whether she was present at an event, whether she had made the evening more or less smooth. He had thought about her as a position in his life, rather than as a person moving through her own life who had intersected with his. Now he thought about who she actually was. He thought about the consulting work she had kept going throughout their marriage, the small firm she maintained, the calls she made from her office that he had heard but never asked about. He thought about the 3 languages she spoke, which she mentioned once, and he had found impressive, and then forgotten. He thought about her grandmother, whose photograph sat on the desk of her home office, and about whom she had told him once that the woman had survived something that would have ended most people, and had done so by being, in her own words, precisely calibrated to what mattered. He thought about the way she had looked at him in the early months of the marriage, with that careful curiosity that was always evaluating, always measuring, not measuring whether he was powerful or wealthy, but measuring whether he was real, whether he was honest, whether he was the kind of person worth being known by. He thought about the fact that he had failed that measurement, not dramatically, not in one moment, but incrementally, over time, in the accumulated small choices of a man who believed that having money meant not having to examine his behavior. And she had watched him fail it, and she had, because she was who she was, responded not with explosion, but with architecture. He found himself looking at the business structures he had built with new eyes. Some of what he saw was, for the first time, uncomfortable. He had spent so long in his world that he had normalized its texture completely. The fear that operated around him, the violence at the edges of the legitimate operations, the way things were maintained through pressure rather than merit. He had told himself stories about this for so long that the stories had become the only thing he could see. Patricia had never told him those stories. She had simply been present alongside the reality and had seen it clearly, and he had thought her silence on the subject was acceptance, when in fact it was something else. She had seen him clearly. She had always seen him clearly. And she had been willing to stay, not despite what she saw, but alongside it, in the faith that the part of him that was worth staying for would grow larger over time. It had not grown larger. He had fed everything else instead. He began to change some things. He told himself initially that he was changing them for strategic reasons, because the legal complications of the past months had revealed certain vulnerabilities in his structures that needed addressing, which was also true. But underneath that reason, which was the kind of reason he was comfortable giving himself, was something more uncomfortable. He was changing things because he could not look at them the same way anymore. She had looked at his world clearly, and he had absorbed some of her clarity, and now he could not unabsorb it. It was not a dramatic transformation. He did not become a different man. He was not built for dramatic transformation, and he had the self-awareness by now to know that claiming one would be its own kind of dishonesty. What he did was begin to make different choices, quietly, in the way that real changes actually happen, one decision at a time, without announcement. He stopped 3 operations that had always been questionable and that he had maintained because they were profitable. He rebuilt 2 structural relationships along lines that were cleaner. He had a long conversation with Oh Seung-jae about what a more legitimate holding structure would look like, a conversation that cost him money in the short term and that he had anyway. None of this would bring her back. He was not doing it to bring her back. He had understood by now that she was not coming back, and understanding it properly, which took longer than you would expect from an intelligent man, meant understanding that she had not left to be retrieved. She had not left to make a point he could address. She had left because she had built a complete life outside his, and she had returned to it when returning to it was possible. He had not been the center of her story. He had been a chapter in it. A significant chapter, one that had mattered and cost her something real, but a chapter, not the whole thing. This was perhaps the most difficult understanding of all, for a man like Park Joong-hyun, who had organized his entire life around the assumption that he was the center. He was the center of his organization. He was the center of every room he walked into. He had assumed he was the center of his marriage. He had not been. She had been the center of her own life, and she had let him stand near it for a while. And when standing near it cost more than it was giving, she had moved forward. In Abuja, 3 months after leaving Seoul, Patricia had dinner with her mother. This was a detail no one in Seoul knew about. Her mother was a retired professor of economics, a small, precise woman with the same dark, observant eyes her daughter had inherited and the same quality of never performing anything. She knew everything that had happened in the marriage because Patricia had called her regularly, in the careful way of someone who speaks freely only to people who have earned it. She had never suggested what Patricia should do. She had simply listened, which was what the best people do. They sat on the veranda with food between them and the evening air of Abuja, doing what Abuja evenings do, and the mother said, "So." Patricia said, "I am fine." Her mother said, "I know you are. That is not what I asked." Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said, I am sad about some of it. Not the leaving. I am certain about the leaving. But there are moments from the beginning, from when it was still real, and those are sad. Her mother nodded. And the rest? Patricia said, the rest is just what it is. A man who was given something he did not know how to keep. There is sadness in that too, but it is more for him than for me. Her mother looked at her for a moment, with the specific love of a parent who recognizes something they hoped their child would become. Then she said, eat. And they ate together in the quiet that is only possible between people who know each other completely. In the months that followed, Patricia's consulting work expanded in ways that reflected what she was capable of when she was not managing the secondary task of navigating someone else's world. She took on 3 new clients and hired 2 people to support the work. She spoke at a conference in Nairobi on trade structures in East African markets and was filmed saying something that was subsequently shared widely about how the most durable structures were not the ones built for power, but the ones built with the assumption that power would eventually need to negotiate with something. She was not talking about her marriage, but she was not talking about it either. She did not remarry quickly or loudly or as a statement. She moved through her life the way she always had, precisely and with genuine attention to what was actually there, rather than what she was supposed to see. She was not hardened by what had happened. She was calibrated differently, which is a different thing. She had learned, through 3 years of very close observation, exactly what to look for in a person. And she was in no hurry, because she was not afraid of being alone. She had never been afraid of being alone. She had been afraid, once, of being alone inside something that was supposed to be partnership, which was a much more specific and devastating kind of alone, and she had done something about it. Park Joong-hyun heard about the conference speech through a mutual contact who had seen the video and mentioned it without knowing the specific weight it carried. The contact described it as impressive. Joong-hyun said nothing in response. He watched the video later, alone, in his office, with the door closed. She was standing at a podium looking exactly like herself. She spoke with the calm, measured precision of someone who understood the subject completely and had no need to perform understanding. At one point, she said something that made the audience laugh, in the way that his audiences had always laughed at her, a little surprised by the humor because it arrived without warning and without performance. She smiled at the response, the way she had always smiled, briefly, genuinely, and then moved on. He watched it twice. Then he put his phone down and sat with what he was feeling, which was something he had not been very practiced at, but was developing the habit of now. Sitting with things rather than moving past them. What he was feeling was not jealousy, not sadness exactly, but something in the vicinity of recognition. The recognition of what a complete person looks like when they are operating in the space they were built for, unencumbered by someone else's limitations. She was magnificent. She had always been magnificent. He had been too busy looking at other things to see it clearly. He made a decision then. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind that gets announced. A quiet, private decision of the kind that only matters because of what it generates in behavior over time. He decided to spend the rest of his professional life building things that were worth building by someone he would be willing to look at clearly. He decided this because he finally understood, in the specific way that cost something to understand, that the version of himself he had been for the first 38 years of his life had not been worth much examination, and he was tired of not being worth examination. He did not know if this would result in anything she would ever know about or care about. He was not doing it for that reason. He was doing it because she had shown him, by being exactly who she was, that it was possible to live with genuine integrity in a complicated world. that you could operate in difficulty without losing yourself to it, and that the self you preserved was worth more than any amount of power that came from abandoning it. She had not taught him this. She had not tried to teach him anything. She had simply been herself in his vicinity for 3 years, and the sight of it, absorbed over time, had eventually produced an understanding he could not unhave. This is what happens sometimes when you are lucky enough to be in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. Even if you fail them entirely, even if you waste the time, some of it gets in anyway. The glass sat on the kitchen counter for a long time. Mrs. Im dusted around it every morning and did not move it, and was never asked to. Eventually, one evening several months after Patricia had left, Joong-hyun picked up the glass and held it in both hands for a moment. He looked at the ring inside. He poured the water out slowly into the sink and set the glass down and held the ring in his palm. He did not put it on. He was not wearing it, but he held it in a way that had weight to it, real weight, the weight of everything it represented, and everything that had not been adequate, and everything that could not be recovered. He put it in the drawer of his bedside table. He closed the drawer. He went to make tea. He stood in his kitchen alone, in the apartment that was his now and only his, and he looked at the city outside the windows, as Seoul lit itself up against the dark, the way it always did, indifferent and relentless, and full of people who were building their lives, or losing them, or finding them, or all three at once. And he stood there and drank his tea, and he was, in the simplest and most accurate description, a man who had learned something very expensive. Somewhere in a clean apartment with good light, Patricia Okonkwo was also making tea. She had good tea, the kind she had always preferred, that she had kept buying throughout the marriage, and that she continued to buy now in the apartment that was entirely hers. The walls had a few things on them: a photograph of her mother, a piece of printed fabric from a market she had visited years ago, a small framed print her grandmother had owned and that she had carried with her across every move of her adult life. She poured her tea and went to her desk. She had 3 documents open that required her attention and a call in 30 minutes with a client in Singapore. She read through the first document with the focused attention she gave everything, making small notes in the margin in her careful handwriting. She was aware of the time and managed it accordingly. She was aware of the quiet in the apartment and was not troubled by it, because the quiet was the right kind. The kind you can hear yourself think in, the kind that belongs to you. She finished the document and picked up her tea. She looked out the window at the city she was in now, different from Seoul, but no less alive, no less moving. She was 34 years old. She was a consultant of considerable ability. She spoke 3 languages and could make jollof rice that would stop a room. She had survived something that had cost her real things, real time, real love, and she was still herself, precisely herself, no more or less than she had ever been. She had not been reduced. She had not been broken. She had not been defined by what had happened to her inside someone else's world, because she had maintained herself inside it, always, the way she had said from the very first conversation she would. I am not someone who will disappear into your world. She had meant it. He had not understood what that meant. And because she had meant it, and he had not understood it, she had remained herself through everything. And when she had walked out into the rain at 3:17 in the morning, she had been exactly who she entered, no part of her left behind, no piece of herself traded away or eroded or given over to someone who had not treated it with the care it deserved. She picked up her phone for the call. And the story, which is not the story of how she escaped him, because she was never someone who needed to escape, which is the most important sentence in all of this. The story, which is the story of a woman who built a complete life and maintained it and protected it and used it to walk cleanly forward when it was time to walk forward. That story continued, as her stories always continued, precisely and on her own terms and with the full weight of herself behind it. He thought she was the one who needed him, but she was the one holding everything together. And when she stopped, he discovered what everything actually meant. Besties, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe right now if you have not, because we are telling more Afro-Korean stories just like this one. If you enjoyed this story, imagine having 20 more unforgettable Mafia Boss romances ready to read or listen to whenever you want. That's exactly why I created the Ultimate Mafia Boss Love Collection. Inside, you'll find 15 complete stories, 20 audiobook versions, and 5 exclusive bonus stories that aren't available on YouTube. You can get instant access through the link in the description. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.